Welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. Depending upon which celebration you're having this coming Sunday, either a typical celebration of the Sunday after Pentecost or celebration of the Reformation, you have basically three different options for the gospel reading. For those not celebrating the Reformation, it's going to be from Luke chapter 19. It's the story of Zacchaeus in the town of Jericho. But for those celebrating the Reformation, you have a couple of different options. One is from John chapter 8. Now, I've already done a video on that reading, and so I will link it in the description of this video if you're interested in looking at that John 8 text. This video is going to be about Matthew chapter 11, the other reading assigned for Reformation. And it concerns John the Baptist, and it concerns violence and the kingdom of heaven, as well as the discussion of what the generation around Jesus thought about John as well as Jesus. And we have this famous saying about Jesus being a friend of tax collectors and sinners. So to help us with some of that, we're going to be looking at some passages from Malachi as well as from Deuteronomy to help us understand who John the Baptist is, as well as what might be implied by Jesus, referring to Jesus as a glutton and a drunkard. So that's what we're going. That's the direction that we're going. The very first question we have to ask ourselves is what exactly is meant by the connection between violence and the kingdom of heaven. So we're going to start out with that opening couple of verses. We're actually going to go back one verse to kind of get the context, and then we'll discuss what it means for the kingdom of heaven either to move forward forcefully or to suffer violence. So Matthew chapter 11, verses 11 through 15 is where we're going to begin. So this first section, which I've italicized, is not in the reading, but it kind of sets the context here. Truly I say to you, this is Jesus speaking, truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So the context of this whole chapter is when John the Baptist has been arrested, and two of his disciples come, sent by him to say to Jesus, are you the coming one, or should we look for someone else? Are you the expected one, or should we look for someone else? And then, of course, Jesus works miracles. He tells the disciples of John to go back and tell him what they have seen and heard. Now, when they leave, Jesus begins to talk to the crowd about John, and he says many things about him. We're kind of picking it up here in the middle of what Jesus has to say. But right before our reading begins is when he says that there's no one greater than John the Baptist who's been born of women. But with the coming of the kingdom of heaven, with the coming of the kingdom that Jesus brings, then everyone who is in that kingdom, even the least, is greater than John the Baptist. Now, the comparison, the contrast that is set up is simply the kingdom that Jesus brings and the new covenant that comes along with that is so much superior to the old that even the least in this kingdom are greater than John, who was the greatest in under the old covenant. So that's kind of where we pick things up. So the very first thing that we need to ask and answer is, how are we to make sense of this long debated, long disputed, difficult text with regard to the kingdom of heaven and violence? So let's look at basically three different options that we have. The first of these is the translation that is recommended by John Noland in his Matthew commentary in the Micah series, where he translates it this way. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven presses forcefully, and those who are violent grab at it. Now, on the left side of this slide, you have both the verb as well as the noun. This is from the same root. The verb is biadzo, which means to do violence or to dominate. It's translated here as press forcefully, but it has this violent connotation to it. Most of the time it's used, it's in a negative sort of way. And then the noun form, biastes, is violent person. Okay? So the way that that Nolan is interpreting this is that you have kind of a contrast between the two sections of what Jesus has to say. So from the days of John the Baptist until the kingdom of heaven, kind of presses forward violently or forcefully. And then he contrasts it with those who are violent, who are grabbing at it, snatching at it. So you kind of have a meeting of these two forces. So the kingdom of heaven moving forward forcefully, violently, but it's clashing with the violent, the biastes, who are going the opposite direction and running up against it. In other words, what he says is you got two kinds of violence that's happening here. You have the positive violence, the positive force of the kingdom represented in the preaching and the teaching and the miracle working of John and Jesus, and that is opposed to the forces that are antagonistic against it. The violent who seize it by force or the violent who attack it. Okay, so that's the one possible interpretation. The second, which is far more common, is this. And this is represented by all those translations which I have on the screen, ESV, New American Standard, NIV, so on and so forth, where they all translate it something like the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, or suffers violence, or has been subjected to violence. And then the second part, the violent take it by force, or have been raiding it, or something along those lines. So these translations understand the two clauses in this statement to be basically parallel, or where the second of these two is it we're expanding and explaining further what it means for the kingdom of heaven to suffer violence. So here, and this is from Craig Blomberg, his commentary on Matthew, he writes, this combination of translations would then lead the verse to be rendered something like, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent people attack it. So this particular understanding, which is far more common, is that the kingdom of heaven is suffering violence, is being attacked by forces antagonistic to it. And as kind of a further elaboration on that, a further expansion of that, it says that the violent are seizing at it, snatching at it, attacking it in various sorts of ways. So that, again, is by far the most common explanation. And I think that's the one that makes the most sense. So during the days of Jesus and John the Baptist, we see a growing opposition to their ministries. Of course, John has now been seized by the violent, by Herod. He's been in prison, and he's about to be violently put to death. He's going to be beheaded. Jesus himself, there's a growing antagonism against him, a growing opposition, and that's going to become violent when he himself is going to be harassed and persecuted and finally seized, arrested, tried, and put to death by crucifixion. So you can see this mounting then opposition against the kingdom of heaven that's taking place as it suffers violence and then as the violent attack it, snatch at it, seize at it. Now, there is one other option for interpreting this. It's not very well known, but I'll put it out there because sometimes you might read it, especially in books that are concerned mainly with a Jewish reading of the New Testament. And that reading is this. So from the days, this is a translation that is provided by those who espouse this view. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven is breaking forth. And every person in it is breaking forth. Literally, it would be those who are breaking out, break out in it or by means of it. Now, this is based on a much later, centuries later rabbinic midrash, so a Jewish interpretation. It's based on Micah 2:12 through 13, which I have there at the bottom of your screen. So David Flusser, I'm not sure how he pronounces his name, but he argues that the image is of the flock of God gathered in a sheepfold. Okay, so you got this flock, they're all gathered together. And then there's a breach maker, and that is identified in this later rabbinic midrash as Elijah, who then would correspond to John the Baptist. So there's a breach maker, so they make a hole, a breach in this pen where the sheep have been kept, in the sheepfold. And then they go before the sheep, and then there's also mention in Micah of the king, which would correspond to the Davidic Messiah. So Micah 2:12 and 13 read thus, I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel. I will set them together like sheep in a fold, like a flock in its pasture, a noisy multitude of men. Okay, so there's your image of the sheep gathered together in a sheepfold. And then he who opens the breach goes up before them. In this rabbinic midrash, that's connected to the work of Elijah, who would correspond then to John the Baptist. They break through and pass the gate, so the sheep are leaving, going at it. And then their king, and the rabbinic midrash understands this to be the Davidic Messiah, their king passes on before them, the Lord at their head. That's certainly a possibility. The only problem with the main problem with that interpretation is, first of all, it's based upon a much, much later rabbinic midrash. There's absolutely no way to prove that that interpretation was common, was somehow being alluded to by Jesus in his teaching concerning John the Baptist. And secondly, the Greek translation, the Septuagint, of that Micah 2 passage does not use that same Greek verb that's used in Matthew 11 concerning the doing of violence. Now, if it did, I would see a lot more justification to that interpretation. But I put it out there just for you to consider it. I think the way to go is the second interpretation, where the kingdom of heaven suffers violence from John the Baptist until now, so during this time period. And those who are violent, they take it by force or snatch at it or attack it. So it's talking about the antagonism, the violence that is perpetrated against the kingdom of God. This is what those who are opposed to God do. This is what those who are led by the dark forces of evil, sinners led by the dark forces of evil, that's what they do. They oppose the kingdom. There's no neutral stance. Either you're for it or you're against it. And those who are against it, we see in the Gospels, are those who seize John the Baptist, arrest him, and then behead him. And then they plot against Jesus. They arrest him. They put him to death. And of course, this continues in the church's history, as in varying degrees, the church is opposed, the kingdom of heaven is opposed, and violence is frequently done against it, just like it was done against John and Jesus. Okay, so that is all about the first verse. Had to kind of spend some time trying to unpack that and understand that. Now, Jesus also says this in verses 13 through 15, so let's talk about it. He goes on to say, "For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." So first of all, there's mention here, and it's kind of flip-flop. We would expect Jesus to say, "For the law and the prophets," but instead he says, "For all the prophets and the law." So it's kind of more of a focus on the prophets. He fronts those. But either way, we're dealing here with at least at this time, the traditional twofold division of what we refer to as the Old Testament. So on your screen, I had that listed as the Torah and the Nevi'im. So the Torah, which just simply means teaching, which is often translated as law, but the Torah, that's the 5 books of Moses. And then the Nevi'im is basically everything else at this point. So that would be the prophets. So the Nevi'im, the prophets that we contain today, what we refer to as history books and the prophetic literature and the wisdom literature, all those writings were kind of lumped together in the second category. Now, what we see also emerging is a growing differentiation between those books in the second part of the Nevi'im, the prophets, so that you begin to have a reference to the writings. And so today, when especially Jews talk about what we refer to as the Old Testament, they call it the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim. And that third group, the writings, would include Psalms, Job, Proverbs, so on and so forth. But anyway, at this point, what Jesus, when he talks about the prophets, all the prophets in the law, he's simply saying the Old Testament. So all the Old Testament, all the Torah and the prophets, they all prophesied until John. And then he says that he is Elijah, that John is Elijah, who is to come. So why would he say that? What's this connection between Elijah in the Old Testament and John the Baptist? Well, the first passage you need to go to is from, in English Bibles anyway, the very last few verses of the last chapter of the last book, the book of Malachi. If you look at the Jewish canon, their last book in the Old Testament is not Malachi, but in the English canon, it is. So Malachi 4, 5, and 6. God says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he," that is Elijah, "will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with the decree of utter destruction." So we have this promise that's looming in Malachi, who was the last of the Old Testament prophets, that Elijah is going to come before this great day of the Lord arrives. So there was a great anticipation of Elijah coming. Well, as we're about to see, Elijah did come. Elijah has come, and that Elijah is John the Baptist. So look at these New Testament passages. This, first of all, is going to be from Matthew's version of the Transfiguration, right after the Transfiguration. Remember, Elijah was one of the people at the transfiguration. And so right after that, the disciples asked Jesus, why do the scribes say that Elijah first must come? Of course, they're saying that because of Malachi's prophecy. And then Jesus answers them and says, well, Elijah does come, and he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come. He's already showed up. And he's talking there about the scribes, they didn't recognize him, but they did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. Well, this more is this language of violence, right? And then he finishes by saying, then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. So Elijah has come, and he suffered violence. And that Elijah who has come is John. Now, there's some other passages that are helpful in this discussion of John and Jesus. So let's look at those now. First of all, John dressed like Elijah. So if you compare 2 Kings 1:8 and Matthew 3:4, which I have on your screen, you will notice that Elijah had a garment of hair, a belt of leather, and then John, mimicking him, wore a garment of camel's hair and a leather belt around his waist. So John dressed even dressed like Elijah. Then his own dad, Zechariah, that is John's own dad, Zechariah, he sings a song about the boy, and in it he says that he, that is John, will go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. So he's Elijah-like. He's not Elijah redivivus. He's not that. He's not Elijah reincarnated or Elijah come back from heaven, as it were, not from the dead, but from heaven. Remember, Elijah didn't die. He was taken up into heaven. So he's not the person of Elijah who's come back down to earth. Instead, he comes in the spirit and power of Elijah. And that helps to explain in John 1:21, which is the last verse I have up there, why John said, I am not Elijah, when the priest and the Levites asked him. They said, what then, are you Elijah? And he says, no, I'm not. So why would he say that? Why would John say that he's not Elijah? Well, he's simply trying to avoid the confusion that people had. He's saying, listen, I'm not Elijah come down from heaven. I'm not that. I'm not Elijah redivivus. Instead, I come in the spirit and power of Elijah. I mean, he didn't say that. His dad said that. But that's the reason that he says, I'm not Elijah. I'm not Elijah, the Old Testament prophet. Instead, he's the one who comes with an office corresponding typologically to the Old Testament Elijah. So the spirit and power of Elijah. So is he Elijah? Well, yes, he is. He's not the actual physical prophet from of old, but instead he comes to fill an office that is analogous to that which was filled by the Old Testament prophet. Okay, so that's the first main section. Let's go to verses 16 through 19. This is the concluding section of the reading. Jesus is speaking here, and he says, to what shall I compare this generation? It's like children sitting in the marketplace, calling to their playmates. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man, of course, that's Jesus' favorite self-designation. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet, wisdom is justified by her deeds. Great quote there, by the way, from Craig Blomberg, kind of summarizing this, that Jesus' contemporaries lament John's asceticism and berate Jesus' indulgence. So they're not pleased with either of them. First of all, let's kind of try to understand who exactly is being referred to here in this little parable, this analogy that Jesus uses. So note, first of all, here's a Greek word of the day, that marketplaces in Greek is agora. That's where we get our word agoraphobia, a fear of public places. So marketplace, agora, agoraphobia. So these are like children. This generation can be compared to a situation, we might say, where you've got children sitting in the marketplaces, the agora, which was kind of the public square. And they're calling to their playmates, we played the flute for you, and you didn't dance. We sang a dirge, and you didn't mourn. Now, it's debated in the commentaries as to who this we is. So is the we talking about Jesus and John, or this generation? So is it Jesus saying, is he kind of including himself in this we, that we played the flute? That is to say, I played the flute, but you wouldn't dance. And then John, well, he sang a dirge, but you didn't mourn. You weren't satisfied with either one of us. Or is it talking about the children saying, kind of demanding that Jesus and John be a certain way. You be this way, but you weren't. You be that way, but you weren't. Either way, you come out to kind of the same place. Either way, the expectation is not met. Whether the flute is played and there's no dancing, or a dirge is sung and there is no mourning. Secondly, what kind of accusation is leveled against both John and Jesus? First of all, they say John, because he lived an ascetic lifestyle, neither eating nor drinking. That is to say, he was not eating and drinking in the way that most people did. He was living this lifestyle where he was depriving himself of things. He was fasting. He was eating only selected foods. He was living an ascetic lifestyle. So because of that, they said he is a demon. Now, we have no evidence in the Gospels of someone calling John demon-possessed. What Jesus is probably referring to is the fact that people thought him so strange, so out of sync with everyone else, that they kind of dismissed him as someone who was demonic, as someone who was so contrary to what they expected that he had to be under the power of the evil one. Certainly they accused Jesus of having a demon. So it makes sense they would accuse John of the same. So then we have also the Son of Man. What about him? Well, he comes eating and drinking, so the opposite of John. And they say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Now, this is fascinating because if you go back to the fifth book of the Torah, to Deuteronomy 21, we have a section about what's to be done with a rebellious son. So if a man has a stubborn, rebellious son, so he won't obey his mother or father, though they discipline him, they try everything that they can, well, then they are to take him out to the elders of his city at the gate. That's where all the court cases were held. And they're supposed to say to the elders, this our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. Listen to this. He's a glutton and a drunkard. Well, if the case is tried and it's found to be true, then all the men of the city are to execute him, stone him to death. Now, I find it interesting that people are saying of Jesus, well, he's a glutton and a drunkard. In other words, he is a stubborn and rebellious son. He deserves nothing but the death penalty. So this is a very derogatory kind of slander that's leveled against Jesus, that according to Deuteronomy 21, that he's nothing more than a rebellious son who deserves to be stoned to death. So this is what people were saying about him. But why are they saying this? Well, because he often ate and drank with tax collectors and sinners, right? And that's why they call him a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And you can see that many times in the Gospels. On your screen, I just put up the section from Matthew 9, 10 to 13, where Jesus is reclining at table, he's feasting, and who joins him? Well, tax collectors and sinners. They're reclining with Jesus. And so the Pharisees are upset by this. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? So this is a case where what's meant to be a great insult, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, ends up being one of the greatest compliments that our Lord ever received, that he's a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Indeed, he was. He was not a glutton and a drunkard. Certainly he ate and drank. He did not lead the ascetic lifestyle that John the Baptist, his predecessor, his forerunner, led. Jesus was eating and drinking. He was enjoying his time with his disciples. And he was often eating and drinking with those that the holier than thous, the uber religious, would not have anything to do with. So he had table fellowship with those that people like the Pharisees would not even remotely consider coming close to have table fellowship with them. So he's not a glutton and a drunkard, but he certainly is a friend of tax collectors and sinners, which is the best of news. I don't know if this story is true or if it's apocryphal, but I heard it many, many years ago, and I've forgotten some of the details, but the essence of it is this. So there's a professor, I think it was at a seminary in St. Louis, Lutheran seminary in St. Louis, who was kind of passing out a sheet, as it were, with all the various titles of Jesus listed on it. And after it was, he passed it around, and the students had to kind of choose, okay, someone's going to do this on Son of Man, someone's going to do it on King of Kings, someone's going to do it on Kyrios, whatever. It's all these titles and designations for Jesus. And when everyone had chosen, the professor looked at the sheet and said, oh, no one chose the best title of all. No one chose friend of sinners. And that is really, is there a better title for our Lord to have than the friend of sinners? That he calls us friends, us who are just the same as the tax collectors, just the same as those who are publicly labeled sinners in that first century religious context. Well, Jesus is our friend. He eats with us. He drinks with us. He has table fellowship with us because he He came to save sinners. So he came to save us, because that's including all of us. Friend of tax collectors and sinners. Praise be to the Father for that. Finally, at the end, Jesus says, wisdom is justified by her deeds. This is most likely a reference back to how the Old Testament and intertestamental literature, such as the Wisdom of Solomon, such as Ben Sirach, personified wisdom. Proverbs 8 does this. And if you've read my book, The Christ Key, I have a whole chapter there that talks in part about wisdom. So wisdom is justified by her deeds. Wisdom was personified, and wisdom fits with many of the ways in which Jesus appeared in the Old Testament. So this is likely, in my opinion, this is likely Jesus' way of making the connection between himself and that personified wisdom in the Old Testament. So that when you see, in other words, wisdom justified by her deeds basically means as you see my life playing out, as you see what's going to happen in the future, you're going to see that my having fellowship, my being a friend of tax collectors and sinners, that deed was indeed justified, because it's by means of this that I identify with the lost, that I come for those who are ostracized, that I give my own life for those who are dead apart from my Father. So in the end, through his life, ministry, death, resurrection, and ascension, wisdom is justified by her deeds. The life of wisdom incarnate is going to be justified because we see the outcome of that is our salvation. Now, to kind of summarize this, if you are preaching about the Reformation, what a great text for this, right? Because it accents, first of all, how the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the church has been attacked by heresies, by those who are opposed to the church from the very beginning. Violence is there. There's persecutions. There's all sorts of struggles over the truth of the proclamation of the good news of who Jesus is and what he's done for us. And there's a focus, of course, in the Reformation upon the Word of God. We have reference here to the law and the prophets, how they prophesied until John. They were the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Torah and the prophets were the means by which God testified of the coming of his Christ. And then finally, when we get to the end, of course, one of the major accents of the Reformation is on grace alone, Christ alone, faith alone. And here we have this beautiful description of Jesus as the friend of sinners. He's the friend of the ones who need his justifying work, the friends of the ones who need his saving work. And that's us. We who stand in constant need of his grace and mercy, which he constantly is ready and willing to give to us because of the work of Christ alone, because of his grace alone, which we receive by faith alone. Well, I hope this has been helpful to you as we walked through Matthew chapter 11. Again, if you are preaching or looking at John chapter 8, I will put that video in the notes to this one. Thank you for your prayers, by the way, this past week. It was nice to know that many of you were praying for me and my family as we remembered the life of our son as his birthday was this past week. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your ongoing prayers for us. And we pray that God's mercy, his grace, and his peace may be yours in abundance. We'll see you next week.